Hi, everyone. My name is Whitney Donhauser, and I'm the Ronay Menschel Director and President of the Museum of the City of New York. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for Our Fair City Home, which is the first event in our new series, Our Fair City, Building for a More Equitable New York, moderated by Justin Davidson and co-presented with Curb. In this series, Justin will explore how we might rethink and rebuild our city's built environment from the skyline to the street with an amazing group of committed New Yorkers. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by three experts to discuss how we can rethink the fundamental subject of housing in the city. Architect Victor Body-Lawson, developer Jonathan Rose, and nonprofit housing leader Barika Williams. We have just two other events coming up in this season for this series. On Wednesday, December 9th, Justin will be speaking with David Ehrenberg of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, community organizer Esmeralda Herrera, and architect Claire Weiss about work and the future of the city's business districts. Then on Wednesday, January 27th, Justin will be joined by the urban designer Justin Garrett Moore to consider all the public spaces and in between home and work. You can find out more and sign up at mcny.org/ourfaircity. In a few moments, we'll welcome our speakers and to the screen. But before we get started, I want to thank all of you who may have contributed to the museum over the past 8 months, whether it's through ticket sales, donations, or other types of support. As we approach this very difficult holiday season, I hope you will remember the museum as part of your year-end giving plans. Memberships, contributions, or even sharing your love of programs like these all play a vital role in ensuring that we can continue to be New York's premier storyteller. So please note tonight, we will be taking questions throughout the whole program via Zoom's question function. We will not be using the hand raising function or the chat function. So we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. If you're watching on Zoom, the closed captioning function is also available tonight. So you can enable that at the bottom of your screen. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Justin Davidson, who will in turn introduce our distinguished guest. Justin has been the classical music and architecture critic at New York Magazine since 2007. He is now the editor of Cityscape as part of Curbed New York Magazine. He won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2002 and an American Society of Newspaper Editors Criticism Award. He has contributed to The New Yorker, W, Travel and Leisure, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and Salon, and he has appeared on WNYC and NPR. He's the author of the wonderful book in 2017 called Manic City, a walking companion to New York. And I think that's a great thing for us now during COVID time. So I highly recommend it to everyone. Justin, over to you.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you everybody for being here. This is exciting. We're about a year out from our next significant earth-shattering, world-changing election, which is the election of the next mayor of New York, and also a significant portion of the city council. So we're really in for a whole leadership change in New York. And of course, over the course of the next year, we're going to be wrestling with emerging from the pandemic and trying to recover from the economic devastation from that pandemic, which makes it a great moment to look at how we do that. And when I think about that, I try to think not so much in terms of an opportunity to do things differently as an obligation to do things differently. So we've invited three great participants for the first part of this series of panels, and this one is about housing. It's a truism about New York that there just aren't ever enough places to live, and those places are almost always too expensive. So we're going to try to wrestle with that and figure out, are there ways of doing things differently in New York that will help us address that situation in the future as New York recovers. So I'm inviting onto our virtual stage the architect Victor Body-Lawson, who has done a good deal of affordable housing in New York, has a long history of working in the city, and Harlem in particular, was instrumental in some years ago in the rehabilitation of the Diego Beekman houses in the South Bronx. Barika Williams, who from the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development, who is one of those people who makes things happen in New York, who brings people together, and who tries to find ways to produce affordable housing in a really often unfriendly environment. And Jonathan Rose, a developer who is also an expert in affordable housing and other kinds of housing and neighborhood development. So these are all people who think holistically about New York, who don't just think about putting up so many units of apartments, but also just how those units of housing contribute to a better city. So we're going to take a few minutes for each of them to give some little presentation about the work they've done. And to the audience, you are welcome to ask questions. As Whitney said, please enter it into the chat function. Those questions will be funneled to me, and I will incorporate them as we go. So we're not going to have a separate question and answer session at the end, but just keep those coming. And this should be an interesting conversation. So Jonathan, let's start with you and tell us what you've been doing.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So we believe that affordable housing is part of is a necessary but insufficient component of creating communities of opportunity. So our question really is, what's the purpose of affordable housing? And it's to help lift people out of poverty or the working poor and into a thriving life. So affordable housing is the base of it, but it needs education, healthcare, access to open space, neighborhood serving markets, particularly with affordable food, connection to arts and culture, including great museums, access to mass transit, livelihood, which is jobs, and actually also access to a spiritual life. We think all these elements need to be woven together around affordable housing. So next slide. So our question has been, how do we do this in an affordable housing project? And one of the things we've discovered is for very little money, we can build, for example, a small room like this, a health exam room, and then partner with a local healthcare agency that brings health exams on site to serve our residents. So what I'm going to begin to show you is how we can incorporate in affordable housing a series of very simple elements that create this community of opportunity. Next. And exercise. So we think that the health provider should be prescribing not only medicine, but diet and exercise, healthy food, stress reduction, yoga, meditation, things, socialization, things like that. Next. This is yoga with kids. This happens to be a project in Newark. Next. And one of the things that's really important today is you can't move forward either in education or in jobs without being digitally connected. So we believe affordable housing needs to have digital access and computers for those who don't have them. Next. So I wanted to show you how we're bringing those all together in a project in New York City. This is in East Harlem, not far from the museum. It's a project that is under construction today. It's called Sendero Verde. We are partners with L&M Development and also a community group called Akasha Network. This is 700 units of housing ranging from formerly homeless to middle income. We deeply believe in mixes of housing. It is all designed to passive house rules, which means it's very, very green, has 4 community gardens, a 50,000 square foot charter school that'll be run by Harlem Children's Zone. It has 12,000 square feet of after school programs, senior programs, health programs, et cetera, with union settlement, a community arts program, and much more, all contained in one building. So the point is, we think the affordable housing, the future should be mixed income, green, full of social services and education, and should present a community of opportunity to itself and its neighbors. Let's just go a few more slides. Next. So if you look, when you see Victor Body-Lawson, behind him is a golden mean circle on his wall. This whole building was designed to the golden mean proportions. So this just kind of shows how the Fibonacci series runs through the facade. Next. And this has a beautiful garden space, a plaza that's open to the public that actually follows an old Lenape trail and has a children's area and a senior area and an amphitheater and a little science park within it, and community gardens, et cetera, next. So we also think that really integrating nature, so remember I said housing, integrate the elements of opportunity, buildings should be really green and integrated with nature. And that's what we think should be the future of affordable housing in New York.
Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan. We'll come back. I have a whole bunch of questions about that project and about what it portends for the future of the city. But in the meantime, Victor, take it away. Victor, you need to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Curb. Thank you, the museum, and everyone that I'm really honored to be here with all of you, Jonathan and Barika. You know, Le Corbusier, one of our great architects, coined the term machine for living. And he believed that buildings were machines for living. I believe that cities are machines for living. I would believe that what we do with our time is very valuable, and where we live and the time that we spend when we live there and the trajectory from the day you move into that city or to that house to the time that you retire or you die should be an empowering event. It should empower the person so that they're better off at the end of their stint in that city or in that building or in that office. So could we start the slides, please? The next one. Next, please. Okay, so again, this is a project that we did with Jonathan's company, Jonathan Rose Companies, and HCCI. This is a project in Harlem. It's a senior building, essentially for 65 seniors. It's typically the market here, the people who live here, are African American. And one of the things that we did in this case was we imported wood from Ghana, and that is what was used in their lobby. The idea here is to create some kind of relationship between the people who lived here and their roots. So one of the things that we also looked at was to see how make this building as empowering as possible so that when they end their lives in this building, in other words, when they moved on, they were much more empowered by it. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yes, one of the things that we also did was it took light into consideration. Again, this is another senior project that we recently completed in the Bronx. It's Home Street residences. There were about 62 units in this building. And it turns out that the lottery system for this building, there were 50,000 people that applied for just these 62 units. And one of the things, again, that we realized is there's a huge need. In the design of the building, we took light into consideration, how to shade windows, how to modulate light as it came into the apartments. Next. Next, please. And the building is essentially on 3 streets. It's almost like in the middle of a piazza, and we wanted to create a form that recognized an old church that was previously on the site. So what we did was we reclaimed wood from the church. We reclaimed pews from the church. We reclaimed the Manhattan schist that was on the church. So there was a memory, again, going back to a machine that living, there's a memory of what was there to what is there now. Next slide, please. So this is the lobby, and this is the rear yard. And again, light is a very, very important part of this project. We made sure that in all of our projects, we put roof terraces or outdoor spaces for seniors to be able to commute together with a corporate space. And on the ground level of the building, there is a community facility that is for youth. In other words, it's created. It's called Dream Yards. Dream Yards is a not-for-profit arts education program in the Bronx that now connects the seniors to younger people, and you create this sort of synergy between the two demographics in the building. Next, please. Next slide. Again, one of the interesting things about affordable housing is cost. Obviously, we try to be cognizant of that. We realize that it has to work for everyone. It has to work for the city. It has to work for the people who manage the building, the owners of the building, and people who live in the building. So what we tried to do was to manage the deployment of materials so that we can essentially bring those costs down, build those buildings quickly enough, and at the same time enable people who live there to be able to reduce their costs as far as things like utilities. So the insulation, the mechanical systems are very important parts of the work that we do. This is a project that we're working on currently. It's in the South Bronx. It's with WXY. We believe in collaborating with all stakeholders, including the architects that we work with, contractors that we work with the communities. In this case, in working with the communities, we had conversations and partnered with various vendors, from grocers, green grocers, banks. There's a video venue in the building, and things that would enable the community to be, again, empowered. So the project, which is located in the South Bronx in that area, is also 6 buildings that is surrounded, that surrounds a park. The park is somewhat defensible, but at the same time, it allows members of the community to traverse it, so that there's this sense that the community is also part of the development. The other thing too that we looked at was to try to make our building a fulcrum that would tie to the rest of the neighborhood, so that it now became a point, a business hub that would enable other parts of the neighborhood to grow just as well as this community grows. It has parking in it. It's got landscaping in the center of the courtyard, and the courtyard, or the plaza, is central and south facing, so most of the apartments in the building get daylight and they get sunlight, and they can essentially look at the plaza, so that it's their eyes on the street. It creates more security, and it creates a corporate environment for people who live in this development. It is essentially a 740 unit complex that was recently, before that, the Spofford Detention Center. So now we're moving it and creating a much more positive environment for people to live in. Next, please. Next slide, please. And this is an image of what the courtyard looks like. We wanted to create we were creating a building that it's a tower, and that building now becomes the central focus of the development. And that way, if you thought about meeting someone at Spofford, you think about that tower. It now becomes a central point in the development. Next. Next, please. So essentially, we believe that housing, affordable housing, should empower people who live there. We believe that affordable housing should be something that people want to identify with, and they want to live with. They want to guard, because the quality of the work that has been put into this place is strong enough that it not only benefits the residents who live there, but it benefits the community as a whole. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Victor. This all sounds so wonderful. I wonder sometimes why, with all of this great creativity and energy that we have in the city, why we actually have the problems that we do. And I don't know, perhaps Barika, you can shed some light on that. So tell us what you're thinking, and we'll come back to some of those questions.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you to Curved, and thank you to the museum, of course, for having me here. So my name is Barika Williams. I'm the executive director at ANHD, or Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And so we're a little bit different. So I'm going to explain a little about who ANHD is first. Our work is to build community power and win affordable housing and thriving and equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers and for every single corner of New York City. Our current housing and economic development policies disadvantage and deliberately marginalize a lot of our low and moderate income communities, our immigrant communities, and our communities of color. And I'm going to talk about that a little further, but it's important to understand that context. Especially in this moment, these policies marginalize the folks who were always, but finally, belatedly being recognized as essential to our city. So ANHD is an association of over 80 community groups, so neighborhood-based non-for-profit organizations here in New York City. And what we do is we work and use research, advocacy, capacity building, data analysis, and grassroots organizing to support our members and to support a broader movement of work that is centered around building equity and justice in neighborhoods and for the city overall. Core to how we approach our work and how we tackle this is understanding a longstanding housing and economic development system that is rooted in racism and oppression. And more specifically, to put a label on it, we believe that true housing justice is economic justice, is racial justice, and that these things are interdependent on each other, and we have to pursue them connected, and that we will not actually ever achieve and reach and address our affordable housing goals without addressing those components. And another core piece of how we think about this is we believe that that economic opportunity, affordable housing, and the elimination of poverty are really interconnected with place and community, which I think both of the previous presenters spoke to, and so that we cannot disconnect what some might try to label as just a housing problem from the broader issues of community, place, and space, and how people experience the totality of a lived in built environment. So let me go ahead and first slide, or next slide. So I just want to go through a little bit as we jump into where we are, and the future is looking at where we are now. And ANHD did some of the initial and very early analysis on COVID's disparate impacts by race. And that's because a lot of what we do is looking at disparities and differences in what's happening in neighborhoods, whether it's data analysis, developments, projects, and outcomes. So the darker red colors on here is where we were seeing the highest rates of, the darker red colors on here where we're seeing the highest rates of overcrowding. The lightest colors on here, the light yellow, is where we're seeing, trying to make sure I'm saying this right, because we check different ones. So this one is dark colors are high rates of COVID, and light colors are low rates of COVID. And so it's the percent of population with COVID. And you'll see this as we go through, that there's a narrative. You've got disproportionate COVID in outer boroughs and predominantly POC, which for us is people of color. You'll hear me say BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color neighborhoods. So next slide. So now what's interesting here is that we see the inverse. And I think this is important as we talk about where we think about housing and where development heads is that there has been this national narrative, New York state narrative, and even New York City narrative that density was part of the problem / is part of the problem. And really that's not the case. Our densest areas in New York City are the dark pinkish colors here. They are not the highest areas of COVID rates here in New York City because they're also the areas where people have the most access to wealth, healthcare, and other resources. So where we actually see higher rates of COVID are in areas that we consider overcrowding, right? And where we see multiple people doubling up, tripling up in units in order to be able to support and sustain their families. Next slide. So that then gets combined with, so this is the overcrowded household. So we see sort of the inverse, right? So compared to the purple of last time versus the red of this time, you can see also how the I guess this is orange. The orange of this tracks with the dark colors of where we're seeing the highest COVID rates, right? So this is starting to create the narrative of COVID combined with overcrowding, which is separate and different than density. Next slide. Which then maps importantly on some of the places where both Victor and Jonathan do some of their work and developments, which is in predominantly communities of color, right? This is where this is happening. Now this feels like not new news, but when we first started, it was very new, right? And not something that people expected or really understood. And the next one. What ends up happening is that also then ends up very closely aligned with where we're seeing a majority of our service workers and essential workers, right? So understanding that the pressures of the housing environment, of lack of affordability, of exposure and potential rates of infection by COVID are being placed on our communities of color, our essential workers, and our service workers at a disproportionate rate. I think there's one more. Yeah, so this is rent burdened households. So this is where we start talking about, and the folks who ultimately end up being served by most of our affordable housing programs, being in the darkest green areas. And so this really starts to create a multi-layer understanding of the huge amounts of vulnerability and instability that we see folks going through prior to COVID, because all of this was probably, but not probably, is definitely very similar in terms of the data and the lived experience, but is made all the more extreme under COVID. And I think there's just one more. Yep. And so the last piece of this is understanding how this overlaps with the decisions that we're making around the built environment. So the dots on here are closed hospitals, hospital closures that we've made as part of our land use decisions over time, many of which and most of which were closed in order to create large-scale luxury developments, and what it means now to not only, right, we think about often we know and talk about food deserts, but now we're also confronted with healthcare deserts and places where people don't have access to the healthcare needs that we think they should have, that we believe that they should have, but also that are now all the more prescient and essential in this moment. So I'll leave it there, Justin, so we can shift over to the conversation.
Great, thank you. I already have more questions for all of you than we can possibly get to in the time we have, but I want to start here, and maybe you can all address this, but I think, Barika, let's start with you, because your maps show a very really tragic and convincing overlap of conditions where the dark areas on all of the maps are mostly the same. So they tend to be the poorest areas, the most racially segregated areas, the highest rates of COVID, the lowest rates of access to medical care. And the one thing that I found particularly interesting is that the highest rates of overcrowding correlate with the lowest rates of density, or not exactly, but there's a lot of relationship. Now, that's all set up because one of the ways that we traditionally get affordable housing in the city is through a set of rezonings. And that has been the de Blasio administration's focus, is to do large scale rezonings in order to build affordable housing. The criticism of that has often been that those rezonings take place in low-income neighborhoods, particularly some of the areas that were darker on all of your maps. I've noticed that there is often anti-gentrification sentiment as a response to those rezonings. You co-authored an op-ed with Brad Lander supporting the Gowanus rezoning as the rare rezoning that takes place in a relatively white, relatively affluent neighborhood. So my question, though, is this. Given that there is the most need for housing in those darker areas on the map, the most low income, the most segregated, and so on, isn't that where we should be putting the city's limited resources and focusing affordable housing on those neighborhoods, and why not? I mean, this is really a question for all of you, but I think Barika, since those maps were yours, you might want to start with that.
So I would start with, I think your characterization of the opposition to the rezoning is partly correct, right? So I think it's important to note that there is community opposition, and especially opposition in Black and Brown communities to rezonings that do not serve and do not meet the needs of what that neighborhood is looking for its future, right? Given who it is and how it sees itself as developing and growing, that any community should have some sort of voice in determining its future direction, right? And the opposition that you're seeing is widespread because of two things. One, it's feeling like this is being done to a community, and specifically to a people of color community, and at the same time, right, in a very connected and very informed both world, but also network of who we are as housing organizations and tenant organizations, very much understanding that ask is not being made of predominantly white and wealthy neighborhoods, that those are the neighborhoods who get to opt out of this process, that they're not required to do this, that when some sort of development or action is supposed to be happening in their area, that they are able to stop, stall, or redirect that process, right? And I think it's important to really highlight in this, because I think it often has unfairly been labeled at folks like ANHD and many of our memberships and groups that what we are is anti-development. And that's actually not really the case at all. And ANHD was founded by some of the earliest community development corporations in New York City more than 45 years ago, right? This is a core part of who our movement coalition is, but we believe that development should be just. It should serve the totality of who New Yorkers are. So it doesn't work to do affordable housing development where the affordability numbers are a $2,000 or a $1,700 two-bedroom apartment in a community where the average household is making $35,000 a year, right? And that is a fair thing for that community to come back and say, nor is it fair for another community in the city to say, we don't want to do affordable housing at all, right? We're happy to build, or maybe we don't want to build at all, but we're not going to take on our share of the responsibility of housing the full income spectrum of New Yorkers.
Jonathan, I wanted to deflect that question a little bit to you and ask you how you take these constraints and translate them into actually buildable projects. I mean, Sendero Verde, and I know some of the other projects you've worked on, Via Verde and so on in the South Bronx, do all of these things, or at least aspire to as best they can, which is, I think, expensive. No, how do you take all of the constraints, and now especially in a time of fiscally, straitened times where money from the city for subsidizing affordable housing is going to be, well, is always in short supply, but it's going to be in shorter supply. How do you balance all of those aspirations with land costs, the scarcity of subsidies? Can you kind of give us a little insight into how the math works?
Yes, but first I want to answer the previous question, because our company is one of the developers of Public Place and Gowanus. And so we have been part of a very extensive community process. There's been years of community process related to this project. And the project will be 100% affordable. So I do think it's been designed to meet many of the community needs and requests. The affordable housing to be built in New York any affordable housing to be built anywhere has to be subsidized. And the subsidies come from the federal low-income housing tax credit, but from city and state resources. And New York City has more generous in its resources and has more extensive capital funds dedicated to affordable housing than any other city in the country. It's a really delicate balance, and it's interesting to watch, because we've been doing this for some time, administration after administration wrestle with this. So there, for example, Sendero Verde, which we think is a really positive contribution to the neighborhood and will dramatically improve the residents' lives. If we just built affordable housing there and didn't have the school and didn't have the community health center and all that, we could probably build another 100 units. So the question is, in a time of desperate need, is it better to just churn out the most cheapest units, or is it better to create places that transform the residents? And my sense is the city has to do both. And so the conclusion I came to, because there was an enormous amount of praise for Villa Verde in the South Bronx and also criticism, it cost 7% more. It's not a whole lot more, but to be super green and to have an exceptional design. So the question is, could that 7% have been spent in other ways? And the conclusion I've come to is that in urban planning, there are foreground buildings and background buildings, and that every neighborhood deserves foreground buildings that transform the people who live around Villa Verde. Proudly say they're part of the Villa Verde neighborhood. That building not only is great for the residents, but it's been kind of a added status to the rest of the neighborhood. So my sense is not only what the ratio is 1 to 10 or 1 to 15 or 1 to 20, but there are locations for foreground buildings, and then there are locations that may be mid-block or smaller or whatever, where the city should get the most units for the least cost.
And before we move on from this, there's a sort of related question from an audience member about these services and maintaining them and perpetuating them, especially like, you know, in the landscaping or the maintenance of the buildings, and maybe the, right, you know, if with passive house technology, you know, that's got to be kept up to speed over time. We've seen NYCHA be the product of good intentions that were then walked away from, and what we're dealing with is a massive, you know, mountain range of obligations and backlog of maintenance. So how does that fit into these relatively higher cost projects, even if it's only 7, 10, 15% more than your basic plain vanilla affordable housing?
Right. So first, the NYCHA case. So NYCHA projects are funded by a little bit by tenant rent and a lot by federal government. And the federal government has underfunded these for decades. And so it's a different funding stream from the way that regular affordable housing is funded. And regular affordable housing is essentially funded by the residents' rents. And it is a skinny budget. I think there's been a really good track record on both the many of the for-profit developers and the extensive community development, not-for-profit. New York also has the most vibrant not-for-profit community development network. And I think if you look over the last 20, 30 years in those projects, you'll see that we've managed to make these budgets work, but they are very skinny budgets. And you're going to see issues because of COVID and because of the lack of employment, because people are losing their jobs in COVID, and people are, some percentage of residents in affordable housing are not paying their rent, and that is going to lead to operational challenges. Or it could.
Justin, could I
jump
into something to connect? Because I think that 7% that Jonathan talked about, that is a bump to make it the more marquee and more creative and more localized project that has some of these community services that the questioner is asking about. I think the other way to think about this is, though, for many of these neighborhoods, what happens if we don't spend it in these projects? Because to Victor's point of one of his projects, there's a technology center, right? These are often the same neighborhoods that have antiquated and no technology in their community and public libraries, right? So we also have to understand and appreciate that there is an inverted need for those sort of robust community components in these projects, because these are the same communities that are deprived of parks and of green space and of, digital hubs and health points as a part of just who their neighborhood is. And that's the history of the city investing huge amounts of resources in certain areas and really depriving certain communities of those where, it was a 5-10 year campaign to get a street light fixed, and a project comes along and is able to actually show real investment in a neighborhood.
As I hear you talking about all the things that housing needs to do, so it's really almost not appropriate to talk about it in terms of just housing. We're talking about neighborhood development, city development. So we're really sort of trying to create that complex layered urban fabric with all of those services and all of that connectivity. But it reminds me a lot of discussions I've had with people about the libraries, which long ago stopped being a place where you just go and check out a book. They've turned into community centers that are absorbing a lot of the pressures of neighborhoods that lack certain services. So they are the places that you go to get help looking for employment, or to get help learning how to use a computer, or simply to get online at all. And language services, applying for citizenship, doing paperwork, all different kinds of things. So I wonder, Victor, as a designer trying to pull all of this complexity into a building that costs as little as possible to fit into those skinny budgets Jonathan was talking about, can you talk about the design challenges of trying to balance all those things?
Of course, but before I go into that, I just want to point out that one of the successes of Verde is that it's mixed income and it has home ownership components to it. I think you can't do this. You can't really get an equitable city without having people own part of it. You see it all over the country. You see between the 50s and the 80s, there was a lot of urban flight. There were a lot of bad urban renewal projects that happened in cities. But once the city started to think about home ownership, once you started to get more of these HDFCs, people started to have a relationship with their cities, with their environments, with their homes. So I think it is very, very important. It's like what you're saying, Barika, that people are anti-development, are anti-rezoning. The reason why they are like that is because they feel like if they live here and they land bank that building or that community for 50 years, at the end of that time, they will have nothing to show for it. They would just have been renters and they would move on. So I think it's very, very important that we talk about home ownership, affordable home ownership. Of course, Jonathan, there are the issues about how do you pay for it, right? How do you raise taxes? How do you get the end user to benefit from for the lack of a better word, the spoils of the city or the wealth of the city? But we have to create a much more equitable city by giving people opportunities to become homeowners. I think that's one of the things. The other thing from a design challenge is that obviously we are at a point now where a hybrid system has become our new normal. Hybrid meaning we're working from home. Everyone literally is working from home. So we are now starting to think about design ways of making cities a much more resilient by allowing homes, whether in multifamily, affordable, to be places where you don't have to spend a lot of energy to get to work. In other words, if we now start to think of our zoning as one that encouraged living and working at the same time, we would now reduce the need to have all of this infrastructure, this spatial infrastructure, like transportation systems and parking on streets and all of that, because we will now be bringing it closer to home. So as architects, we're now thinking about bringing services closer to homes, putting in the daycares, putting in the schools, putting in the banks, putting in whatever is needed to support the home. And at the same time, if you're looking at a multi-family building, maybe a 20-story building, maybe the offices, you actually have commercial on the roofs, so that the person would leave their apartment and go up to it, and it possibly have people coming to visit, to go to work in that building as well. So the idea is to try to create this environment that would be pockets of activity that would allow less pressure on the city as a whole. The whole thing about restaurants, for example, if you look at restaurants now, they can actually have spaces on the street. That's now claiming the street and using spaces more for pedestrian uses.
So this idea is actually official policy in Paris. The whole idea of the 15-minute city where everything is at hand, city services, whether it's medical services, and also employment opportunities to reduce the distances that people have to commute and how much they have to use the city as a whole. And on the one hand, it seems like you could have these sort of self-sufficient pockets of the kind you're talking about, Victor. On the other hand, that sort of like live, work, play, like everything in one package kind of gives you Hudson Yards, right? Where you can, take the elevator down from your multi-million-dollar condo to walk across the plaza and up to, your corner office. And I wonder how realistic that is for the population that is most in need of affordable housing. Barika, your maps suggested to me that a lot of the places that we're talking about that are most in need are not people who are necessarily going to be working at home. They still need to, they're essential workers, they're service workers, they are centralized workers, and they have long commutes, and it's going to stay that way. So what do you think about integrating all of these things in affordable housing? Or really should we just be going for the maximum number of units, provided we're also supplying it with open space and services and so on?
So I mean, we do not support the idea of going for the maximizing the number of units, because honestly, the history of what we've seen in New York City means that when we try to max out our affordable housing units, that we make really bad policy decisions that have adverse impacts on the communities that, in theory, those units are trying to serve, right? And this, I know Paris has moved this forward, so it feels new, but the idea of a 15-minute city and a walkable community is not new. And as an urban planner, it dates all the way back to the idea of a neighborhood school, and a neighborhood school was the center of that walkable unit, and everything else was in walking distance of your elementary school, and the nexus, or the hub of the walking distance, was the school, right? But I think the first off, we have to acknowledge that any sort of ability to execute on anything that remotely looks like that really depends on the ability to integrate and address the facts that we have very segregated communities and cities, right? So if my job location as an essential worker is in Manhattan and there's no affordable housing opportunities in Manhattan, there is no scenario where I have a 15-minute walkable community. In fact, what we're struggling to get to is, do they even have a 15-minute commute? And the answer right now is we're wildly far away from that, right? So to connect this with all the, right, I know, Justin, you were like, we're trying to focus on housing, but this came up very clearly when COVID first hit, because the focus was the main transit hubs. It was still the thinking of, well, what's the transit center of New York City? And that was Midtown and that's downtown. But where we really needed transit was for our essential workers to get to those hospitals. That's a completely different way of focusing and looking and understanding the needed transit lines. So you had bus lines that were massively overcrowded. Meanwhile, you had subways that were continuing to run that were basically empty. And so I think we just have to a certain extent, appreciate that what we want is that everybody has access to the things that they need in 15 minutes within their home, but recognize that the way we are structured in New York and in New York City, the history of redlining and the history of segregation in the city means that people are innately going to have to move between places as we do the long, decades-long work of starting to undo those systems.
I want to get back to a question about rezonings a little bit, because there are several that are in the works. We talked a little bit about Gowanus. Industry City, of course, wasn't really about housing, but there was a fear of displacement, and that went down. There's another one in the works now in Flushing that some people in the neighborhood are opposing because it seems, and Brad Lander, the council member, you wrote that op-ed with supporting Gowanus, who's one of the main movers behind the Gowanus rezoning, opposed that along with a number of other city council members because it just didn't have enough affordable housing. That's still out there. So I want to ask you, in the time we have, what can we do, given how long this takes, given all of the constraints, to improve the system we have to work with, to get the results that you are all pretty much in agreement we need to have, and we have some mechanisms to do it, and you've shown in your work that it's possible, but it's rare, and the system sometimes seems to militate against it. So, what would you say to somebody who's running for mayor or city council now that could be changed to change the process by which we get projects that are more successful, as opposed to just take it or leave it? Here's what the developer proposes. If you don't accept it, then we're going to go back to whatever they can do as of right without the city's intervention, and that's worse. So is it, it can be a choice between bad and worse. How do we get to good choices? Anybody want to take that?
So I have a proposal. So under the city charter, there is a methodology for neighborhoods to propose their own zoning and take it through ULURP. And this has almost never been done. It was actually done in the South Bronx in the 90s, when nobody believed, by a group called Nos Codemos and others, at a time when very few thought anything was going to happen there. And in fact, that zoning plan and that was done under the Giuliani administration, which was kind of annoyed that a community group would do its own zoning, but it kind of figured no one's ever going to build in the South Bronx, so we don't care. So what, you might as well let it happen. And that's the zoning that allowed Villa Verde a decade later to get built. So I would is it 198A? I can't, there's a number that, Barika, do you remember that? You're on mute. What's the number?
I think it's 197, right?
Yeah, 197. Okay, thanks. So I would really strongly encourage the communities be given the resources, which means money, because it does take the 197 in the South Bronx. I haven't been a volunteer in it. There were tons of volunteers that helped out, but communities should have access to resources and to be able to hire planners and architects and environmental assessors, etc., help them do this, and then they can plan their own future.
Victor, I think you were involved in just such a project with the Diego Beekman houses, right? About 20 years ago. And they're trying to extend that planning to, broaden that. Victor, I think you designed their rehabilitation of some of those, but they actually did do a neighborhood rezoning, which so far I believe has been installed.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing with the Spofford project. Obviously, there's a lot of stakeholders that have come together to make this happen. And essentially, we're literally transforming a part of the South Bronx to what it is now. But to go to your question, what would be ideal? I mean, without being utopian, I think one has to understand what we're dealing with right now. We have to understand the inequities that are going on. We also have to understand that we're at an inflection point where technology and commerce have now come together to create a totally different environment. And as a result, cities are becoming less populated. We're now seeing that there's a lot less density in cities because you don't need to be in a city to work. So how do we use that as an advantage to build up on the future? I think if I were to advise a mayor, I would suggest that they understand what that really means. What does this hybrid environment mean? Does it mean that you've got downtown areas that no longer have offices that are occupied? And is it possible to repopulate those with housing, and not only market rate housing, but affordable housing, and with community facilities that benefit them, again, to create this 15-minute environment? I think that is probably going to be the utopia that we will be seeing for in the very near future.
Barika, do you want to expand on that at all? I mean, one of the questions that I'm getting from the audience in various different forms is, how about, as Victor says, using offices that aren't being used right now for housing? How about converting hotels that aren't being used to housing for people who are homeless? How about changing all the zoning basically to be able to mush everything together, because we still have these categories that are sort of, predicated on that, not having the, smelting furnace next to somebody's apartment, but that's not the city we're actually living in now. So do you have a sense of how much we need to change that system, those rules, in light of what we've experienced over the last year? Or is that just temporary and we should and will click back into the city that we had in 2019?
No, I think to a certain extent, Victor's correct that there are changes that have been brought about by COVID that are going to be here to stay. I think it's pretty hard to look at what we've gone through in the past year and not understand that there are going to be permanent ramifications and adjustments that we as a city and built environment need to go through. And in some ways, we can look at what the financial district went through post 9/11 as examples. A lot of those buildings had to make the decision of whether to go residential, whether to go commercial, in the aftermath of a disaster and devastation that was really concentrated in a specific area. But I think the greater question for us as a city is if we know that we have this massive affordability crisis, right? And when we look at what that actually means and what the numbers are, that it's really hard to understand how even the conversion of some of our existing properties to housing will relieve our affordable housing crisis unless we're able to convert them to actually truly affordable housing, right? So it's one thing to convert a commercial property to a residential property, but if it's another residential property that's renting at $2,800, it's not really clear how that's going to help the 75% of New Yorkers who make less than $75,000, right? It's not actually going to serve them all that much, right? And so there's been a ton of stuff in the press around, well, prices are going down. Condo prices have dropped from $750,000 on average to $665,000. Well, okay, right?
Thanks a lot.
Like for most of the folks in New York City's environment, going back to Victor's conversation around home ownership, that's still wildly out of reach for somebody to then potentially look at building and becoming a homeowner, right? Jonathan, I forgot the A, it's 197A. And I think it's interesting as we sort of go back and think about the rezoning side of this, there are a number of communities that have proposed counter rezonings or their own independent rezoning. Chinatown proposed a rezoning. The Bushwick community proposed an alternative rezoning plan. And those are all things that the city has refused to engage in and take up, right? And so I think one of the key questions that we've really got to put to the next administration is, are they willing to take up a land use agenda and plan that says, this is what we need as a city overall, we recognize that part of this has to be an understanding of equity, and part of this cannot be a like everything looks the same everywhere, because fair is not fair and power is not the same everywhere. And we need a land use and development process that really recognizes that.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I want to ask you, we've been talking about affordable housing, which is not the whole picture when it comes to housing. And of course, that's part of a whole ecosystem of housing at every economic level. So just in the last few minutes, I want to ask you about the role of regular old private developers who are building because that's the business they're in, and not necessarily because they're mission driven, although if you're in that business, presumably there is a mission to provide housing. And in particular, I want to get your reaction to one of the few concrete proposals that's come out of any of the candidates for mayors so far, which is from Scott Stringer, the idea of universal affordable housing, which is not predicated on any of the things we've been talking about, land use, rezonings. It simply says that in a sort of simple way, we're going to legislate this. Every new building with more than 10 units must set aside 25% of its units to be permanently affordable. And that basically brings in the for-profit development sector in a different way than we have so far, which is basically to try to get private development and market rate units to cross-subsidize affordable units. So I'm just throwing that out there, but I'd like to sort of go quickly around and get your reactions to that, and to what role you think regular old private developers should be playing in order to make this a fairer city rather than aggravating the inequities that are already there. Maybe Jonathan, you want to take this over since you are in fact a developer.
Okay, so first of all, I deeply believe in mixed income housing, and I like the idea of mandatory inclusionary housing. The issue with what Scott has described.
Right, just to interrupt 1 second. There's a difference between mandatory inclusionary housing, which is actually something we have, and universal affordable housing, which is Scott Stringer's proposal.
Exactly. So I was going to go there to that difference. So it seems to me what Scott is saying is you have to do this, and we're not going to provide any subsidies. You just have to do it. And the issue is that will the economics work? And if the economics work, then no housing will be built. The programs that are used in New York are very carefully studied, and the pro formas are very transparent. Everybody knows the costs, and they're designed to just work. So what'll happen is that my sense is, and I haven't run a pro forma on it, but to have 25% affordable housing, essentially the building, if the market rates are high, so if they're moderate, you probably can't do it in a place like Astoria, but you probably could do it in a place like the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side, if the land cost is zero or almost next to zero. So what this will traditionally, what it should do in terms of economics is drive way down the land cost, because then in effect, the land cost is what would provide the subsidy. There has to be some subsidy. And most landowners are probably going to say, I'll just wait and see if there's another administration coming. So my sense is what you would get is just a stall of construction.
Victor, do you want to follow up on that at all?
I totally agree with Jonathan. It's about land costs and subsidies. But from a design standpoint, I think the only way that we can do it as design professionals is to continually look for ways of making buildings much more economical and at the same time much more environmentally friendly and sustainable. We want to constantly try to bring down the cost of construction and cost of long-term maintenance so that it applies across the board. From a design standpoint, I think that's the way that we look at it. And also, we also want to rethink the way we use our cities, the way we use our offices, and figure out ways of making those costs lower, but yet much more sustainable.
Barika, I'm going to give you the last word here, but I want to tee it up. When I talked to you for an article I was writing, one of the things you said stuck in my mind, which is that we have a trickle down housing policy where, you know, private developers build luxury housing, and then there are these little crumbs or trickles of affordable housing that come down. Is there a way out of that?
Yeah, and we need it. I think at the end of the day, we're going to keep doing these panels every 4 to 8 years, and have similar revolving conversations if we can't figure this out. You know, I'm not sure if this is breaking news, but the actual original proposal that ended up with what we now call mandatory inclusionary housing was universal affordable housing. It was originally an ask by community groups and affordable housing groups that said we need the original United States original inclusionary housing program, which is based in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just you build some affordable housing as part of building. It's just part of doing business. And the way that this policy program works best is to consistently build to the need by everyone over time. And this goes back to your earlier question, Justin, of the numbers, not trying to hit big numbers in a very, very short amount of time. The idea of MIH works best. You do have higher incomes cross-subsidizing for the lower income units that are harder to build and cash flow as an independent building, right? And I think, you know, we constantly hear, I'm sure, Justin, you hear it as a reporter, and we hear on the radios, people are like, I want 70% affordable and 30% market rate. Well, that's because that's kind of what New York's demographics break down as. So it makes a lot of sense. If we continue as a city to be 70% luxury and maybe 30% affordable, we're never going to get anywhere.
Well, thank you all very much. That felt like the beginning of a long conversation rather than the whole thing. Obviously, I still have a long list of questions that we didn't have time to address. But every time I talk to people in this area and about other things in New York, I'm just so struck by the depth of expertise and caring and love for this city and creativity, and it's just a real collective willingness to make this city better and better. And that's really always an invigorating thing as a reporter to talk to people day after day who feel that way. And it's a real antidote to the gloom of everything else. So I hope whoever the next mayor and city council members are listen to you guys. And thank you very much for participating. And that'll do it. I hope everybody will tune in for the next iteration of this series, which is about work. So we structured it as home, work, and in between. And those are going to be our 3 panels, 1 a month. So check this space. But the next one is in December. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you to the Museum of the City of New York, to Curved for presenting this. And thank you to our panelists. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone from the Museum of New York.
Thank you. So long.
Jonathan, Victor, Barika, and Justin. See you in December to look at work.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. So long.
Thank you all.
Thank you.